Hey guys, welcome to our epoxy pour video. Like our concrete pour video, we decided to make an epoxy pour just because it's kind of a complicated process and it helps to see it all step by step before you pour. So if you follow along with this, you'll probably have an easier time pouring your epoxy. To start off with here, we have our mixing cups. We have a small mixing cup for doing our first initial layer. That way when we have our big pour later, everything sticks to the concrete really nice and evenly. We have our stirring sticks to help get everything properly mixed up. We have our brush to make sure we get a nice even coat across our concrete. Following that, we have our cleaning supplies. We do have some leftover concrete dust and leftover debris after we poured our concrete, so it's good to have a nice clean surface before we actually pour epoxy. We have our epoxy kit here. It comes with part A and a part B. Those get mixed together along with the dye kit here, and what we do is we just use one kit. As we go nice and slow, we make sure we're careful while we're pouring, and we're just going to need one kit. Following that, we have our heat gun. Make sure to take care of any bubbles that come up to the surface, so that way we get a nice glossy, glassy surface with our epoxy. Then we have some tape here to seal off our drains, make sure epoxy doesn't get down in the drains, as well as sealing the outside flange of the MR-1 itself. We seal the edge because that way we're going to be putting the enclosure on it later, and we might want to make sure we have a nice clean surface. Following that, we have our PPE. We do use a mask because there are some fumes that come up from the epoxy, as well as gloves, so that way we make sure we don't have any cured epoxy on our hands, and we don't get it on our clothes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to come over to our drains and we're going to take a look at our tape. What it did is our tape sealed off the concrete before, did a good job keeping dust out, but now we're going to take off the old tape and put down some new tape so that way it can get a fresh seal around there and we're ready for our epoxy pour. So all we do here is it can be a little difficult taking the tape off here, so we just come in through with like a flathead screwdriver, just kind of get any of the hardened concrete here that's around the edge, just kind of break it loose. And then what we're going to do is we're going to slowly peel back the tape, just trying to keep out as much of the concrete dust and debris as we can so it doesn't fall down into the drain. Now, it's not a perfect process. It's all right if you get some dust down into the drain. What we can do is we can brush it out afterwards just to clear it off. All we're trying to do here is just keep the majority of it from falling down into the drain. Might be a couple little pieces here that we might have to come through with the screwdriver. Just to make sure that every last piece of tape is off of there. All right, so all our drains are completely sealed off, fully taped. What we're going to do now is we're going to make sure our top surface is completely clear of dust and debris. So the first thing we start off with is we come through with our flathead screwdriver, and we just get down into all the bolt holes that are in here. Make sure all the rocks, any large chunks that might have worked their way down in there are clear. As well as our smaller threaded holes, we're going to grab a smaller flathead screwdriver and just get down in there. These are going to be especially important because this is where our vices are going to be mounted to. So we really want to make sure that there's no rocks in any of these little holes. After that, we're going to move on to actually scrubbing and dusting this top surface here. Just kind of come through with a brush and make sure you get all the dust and little rocks that come off your top surface of your concrete. This is where if you didn't tamp very well in the last step and you get a lot of surface water up on the top, this is where it's going to kind of come back to bite you because there's going to be a lot of this surface dust to remove the less you tamp. So just kind of come through with your brush, make sure you get all this dust and dirt off. And what we want to do is we want to just kind of get this top layer of concrete off. You don't have to go too far with it, just enough to make sure that everything loose is free and clear. And what we also want to do is we also want to make sure this outside flange of our chip tray is clear. We want it to be extra clear so that way when we put tape around the outside, we're going to get a good seal. And we want to make sure that our top surface of our concrete is really clear. That way when we pour our epoxy, it actually has something to stick to. Otherwise, if you don't, it can start peeling off or it can start chipping loose, and that's going to be bad. So brush it, do whatever you need to do. If you have a shop vac or if you have an air system in your shop, go ahead and use that. It'll help speed up the process pretty considerably. And just in the interest of time, so you're not watching me do this for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to go ahead and put a cut in here. We're going to skip ahead to when we have a clean machine and we're ready for further taping. All right, we're back with a nice clean surface. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go along the outside edge of our chip tray. We're going to put down a fresh layer of tape just to make sure that everything stays nice and sealed off. So I'm going to start by coming over here to the corner, just getting a little bit of tape laid down. And then I just come back along with it and press down as I go along. I find that it's a little easier to do it this way. Gives you a little bit more control about where the tape goes. So that way you're not trying to rip off one giant piece of tape and trying to wrestle it into place. Now we're just going to kind of fold it over. Make sure everything's nice and sealed. And then move on to the next 3 sides. What we're kind of looking for when putting this tape down is just kind of cover this top edge here. What you don't want to do is you don't want to go too far into the middle, because then what's going to happen is that when we pour our epoxy in the middle, it's going to get on the edge of that tape and cure, set it there. That way when we go to rip the tape off, we have this long ribbon of tape that's set in our epoxy, and that is a pain to get out. So just while you're putting the tape down, just make sure it's leaning a little bit more towards the outside of the machine and not towards the inside. So I'm going to go ahead, finish taping the rest of this here, and then we'll get up to mixing our epoxy. All right, on to the fun part. So what we have our 2 parts of epoxy here. We have our part B and our part A. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick visual check because it is important. And we're going to take our part A and we're going to put it off to the side for now. We're just going to be working with part B. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to unseal my part B, open it up. What we're going to get ready to do is we're going to get ready to put in our dye syringe. So all this is just a syringe full of pre-mixed dye. It's going to make it so that way when we mix our epoxy, it's going to make it the exact same color of what we want it to be. I'm going to start with taking my ball bearings and adding them to our part B. And what this does is it just adds a little bit of agitation to the mix. So that way when we're mixing in the dye syringe, it mixes it up nice and evenly and gets it a nice even coat. I'm going to carefully remove the tip here because this dye is the real deal. Once you get it on your hands or on your clothes or anywhere, it's going to stay there. I'm going to slowly add in the dye to our part B. And we're getting ready to mix it up. Okay, just make sure you get all of it out. And then I'm just going to take it and put it straight back in the bag. That way no accidents happen and no shirts are ruined. I'm going to put the cap back on, get it nice and tight, because we're going to be picking up and mixing it now. So I'm just going to give it a good even shake for at least 5 minutes. We recommend going 5 minutes so that way we get a nice even mix. And that way we're not going to get different color patches in our epoxy when we pour it later. So I'm sort of shaking it from the side. I'm going to mix up my shaking angle. Mixing it at different angles just kind of helps get it more thoroughly mixed. If we shake it from one side for too long, it might just be moving back and forth rather than doing the mixing how we want it. All right, save us a little time. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to where I have this fully mixed, and then we're going to get ready to do our epoxy seal coat. We got a great looking consistency on our part B, so we're ready to move on to mixing these two together and get ready to pour our seal coat. What that seal coat's going to do is it's going to seal in our concrete completely, and it's going to seal all the little cracks and crevices between the concrete and the chip tray. That way no moisture actually soaks into the concrete itself, and no moisture slips down underneath that concrete, just sit in the chip tray. So what we do is we're going to pour 10 ounces of part B and 10 ounces of part A into our graduated measuring cup and mix them together really well. It is important to know that this seal coat, it needs to sit on the chip tray for 6 to 8 hours. And that is an important window because what we don't want to happen is we don't want to not wait long enough and have our seal coat be too wet and everything just kind of mixed together when we pour in our flood coat, or wait too long and have this seal coat get too hard. If it gets too hard, then the two layers of the flood coat and the seal coat aren't going to stick very well together, and we're going to have to go through and we're going to have to scuff up the whole surface to make sure that the flood coat has something to grip onto. So just start off with here. I'm going to take my part B, and I'm going to look at we went ahead and got graduations here so we can see just how many ounces we're pouring in. So I'm going to go ahead and pour my 10 ounces of B. Okay, seal coat is mixed. We got our cup ready. What we're doing now is we're going to be going through and just getting a nice even pour across the whole surface of our concrete here. And what we're going to be doing after we get a pour all the way through is we're going to leave just a little bit left at the bottom of the cup, just in case while we're brushing, if we notice any spots that we've missed, we have a little bit of epoxy left to get any of those missed spots. I'm going to go through, I'm going to pour everything here, then I'm going to go through and I'm going to brush, get a nice even coat throughout the whole concrete, and I'm going to pay extra special attention to where the concrete meets any metal. Along those seams, we really want to paint the epoxy in there, make sure that it gets nice and coated. That's going to keep any coolant and any moisture from getting into the concrete and also keep it from getting down underneath. So I'm going to go ahead and put my mask on. That way, any fumes that might come off the epoxy, I got a little bit of protection for. All right, so as you can see, just got a nice even coat throughout the whole thing. Don't worry if you're going a little too fast, or go ahead and just go back over that spot again. Make sure you get a nice even coat all the way around. I've left a little bit in here because I can see there's a couple spots back there that I'm going to need to go back through and do a little bit more pour over. I've started brushing the top surface of the concrete here just to make sure that gets sealed. And then extra special attention to the edge of the chip tray with the brush and the front of our base plate here. That's where you're going to see most of the coolant. Try to get down under. So extra special attention to those. Again, we're going to do another quick little time skip here. I'm going to go ahead and get all the surface painted. I'm going to make sure I get all of my cracks and crevices covered. And we're going to show you the results of that. Just pulled off our Bob Ross. We got all of our concrete surface painted. Made sure to pay extra special attention to the seams as we were going around to make sure coolant doesn't get down underneath there. As we will go ahead doing that, if you do notice that any epoxy gets onto this top surface here, what you're going to want to do is you're going to wipe it off before it cures, because it can be a pain later on. So you're going to want to make sure you pay extra special attention to that. So as you're going along wiping, if you do notice that any bubbles start to come up through the epoxy, that is normal for the epoxy process. What you can do is you can grab a heat gun, you can put it on low and just kind of hold it back a safe distance away and just hold it over any areas that have bubbles on them. And what that'll do is that'll just kind of slowly work up those air bubbles out of the epoxy. You definitely don't want to hold it too close, because what that can do is it can disturb the seal coat that we did. And if you don't have a heat gun, you can also use alternatives like a hair dryer or a torch. Just be extra careful if you're using a torch, because not only if you hold it too close will it disturb your seal coat, but it'll also scorch and discolor your epoxy. So go ahead, do one quick once over, make sure everything's set. And then 6 to 8 hours later, we're going to be doing our flood coat when everything is nice and tacky still, and we'll get a nice, good seal. All right, we're back after our 6 hours. Just coming here to check on my epoxy to make sure it's tacky and sticky how I want it. It is. I'm getting some good stick here with my gloves, so that's perfect, just the way we want it. If it were too hard, or if it had cured up past the 8-hour mark, it's not the end of the world. We can still pour our epoxy flood coat. But before we do that, we would need to take some rough grit sandpaper and just go over the entire surface, make sure it's all scuffed up, so that way when we do pour our epoxy flood coat, it has something to grip onto and bond to. Besides that, we also want to check the level of the machine. If the machine is off level, we definitely want to take care of that before we pour our flood coat. What can happen is that if we pour the flood coat on an unlevel machine, it can get one side much higher than the other. And what's going to happen is that it's going to be a very visual the change in your machine, as well as flood coolant can pool in some areas and not drain properly. So now, once we get all those checks taken care of, we're going to mix up the rest of our epoxy in that same 50-50 ratio, and we're going to start pouring it evenly throughout the machine to do our flood coat. All right, showtime. Time for the big pour. We have the rest of our epoxy evenly mixed, 50-50. We have our main pouring bucket over here, and then we have our smaller adjustment bucket to the side. We're going to go ahead and just start with our main bucket, get most of our flood coat poured, and this little adjustment one will be for any highs or low spots that we see later. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by pouring this evenly throughout the whole table, going nice and slow. We're going to kind of be going back and forth here just to kind of spread the epoxy out as much as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and get that pouring, and then after that, we're going to jump into the smaller pour. So I tried to just go around as evenly as I could, just to distribute a nice even layer. You will start to see the epoxy kind of flow into the corners a little bit. And that's where you can start getting a really good idea of where you need to start building in afterwards. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with our smaller cup. And we're going to go in and fill all the areas we missed with this one. All right, home stretch. We got our last little bit of epoxy here that we're going to use to just kind of touch up any low spots that we have around the table. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to visually see where my low spots are. So I'm getting some around the base plate here especially, and towards the back of the machine and towards the side. So those are the areas I'm going to want to focus on the most. With this last little bit of epoxy here, we want to pour extra slow, just to make sure that we use the last little bit to cover these low spots first before we pour the rest of the machine. Once we get those squared away, we can use the remainder of our epoxy to get a nice general pour. All right, that's pretty much it. We got all our low spots filled in. We've used the rest of our epoxy here. Any little bits of epoxy that you get on the rails, go ahead and wipe those up right away, just to keep them from curing. So I'm going to do a quick visual check to make sure everything's clear. And I am starting to see some bubbles come up already. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, take the heat gun, go ahead and go over the entire surface, give it a good once over, that way to get any bubbles. And if you do the entire surface all at once, you make sure everything looks nice and uniform and very clean, very consistent. So remember, hold the heat gun about 6 to 10 inches away from the table. That keeps you from getting any rippling effects in your epoxy, as well as it keeps it from scorching the epoxy in case you hold it too close. All right, I guess to the last step. We've made it this far and our epoxy looks great. So now go ahead and take your time. The epoxy does take about 24 hours to fully cure. So you can really take your time with this step, and then make sure you don't touch the machine or move it or do anything until those 24 hours are up. It's really going to pay off in the long run, and your table's going to look great. So thank you for watching this video. Let us know if it helped you out, and feel free to catch us in the next one. So I'll see you then.